Good evening, everyone. You're all very welcome here to St. Patrick's College, Maynooth, for one of the highlights of the year, the Trocaire annual lecture. It just falls to me just to begin with some words of housekeeping. Firstly, there are toilets at the back through the door or at the archway through which you came earlier. In case of an emergency, just let's remain calm and we'll leave through the door in which we came in. And then lastly, to ask you all to turn off your mobile phones. A special welcome goes to all those who are joining us online. There are hundreds indeed joining us online, so that you're very welcome here to St. Patrick's College this evening. Whether you're members of the Irish Episcopal Conference, colleagues, students, parishioners, members of the Trocaire family, you're all very welcome indeed. I'm going to leave the introductions to Mr. Sean Farrell now, but Dr. Slim, you are very, very welcome indeed.
Thank you very much, Father Michael. Just want to start off by just reminding people that this session is being recorded. We had huge sign up online. I think, Hugo, you're a massive draw because we had more sign up online than we've had for any of the previous Trocaire St. Patrick's College Maynooth lectures. So just to remind people that this is recorded. There will be time for questions and answers once Hugo has finished his lecture. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's my honour to introduce Dr. Hugo Slim. Hugo is the director of the Las Casas Institute for Social Justice and also a senior research fellow at the Institute of Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict at the University of Oxford. Hugo has a very, very interesting and varied career because he has combined the areas of academia, policy making, humanitarian diplomacy and frontline relief operations. Hugo has worked for a number of non-governmental organisations in the field and the United Nations. He has also been the head of policy and humanitarian diplomacy at the International Committee of the Red Cross. Added to his extensive practice in the areas of humanitarian response, he is a very accomplished academic and author, starting from his work around killing civilians, method, madness and morality in war, which was published in 2007, to his more recent publications. Recently, Hugo published a work that Trocaire were partly involved in sponsoring, which was called Humanitarianism 2.0, New Ethics for the Climate Emergency. We're absolutely thrilled and delighted this year to have Dr. Hugo Slim with us. We look forward to hearing his reflections on care for creation amidst the cries of war, and as the last few days have shown us, how relevant the topic is as we look at our TV screens every night. Dr. Hugo, you're very welcome, and thank you for coming to Maynooth.
Thank you, Sean, for a nice warm welcome, and thank you, President, as well, for welcoming me to this wonderful college. And thank you very much for inviting me to give this year's annual Trocaire Lent lecture. It's a great honour to speak in this great college of St. Patrick to such an esteemed and committed audience in the room and online. And it's a particular honour to do so as a British scholar. It's been one of the great joys of my lifetime that British and Irish people have made peace and come to enjoy the fullness of each other's company again. And this was not the case when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s. And happily, in my adult life, things have changed, and I've been able to know and love the joy and genius of the Irish people. And I'm so glad we are neighbours, and I'm so sorry that my people have hurt your people in the past. In my field of humanitarian aid and international relations, Irish genius is nowhere more evident than in Trocaire. Its mission, its people, and its way of working. This famous organization, and it really is famous in the humanitarian and development world, it's that we celebrate this evening, lives out great Irish and Catholic virtues every day with communities all around the world, where it shows immense kindness, lasting friendship, good humor, practical wisdom, and a strategic determination for justice and peace. Trocaire does all this with the intelligence of faith. Our faith knows that not everything will be made good or stay good in this world. But we also know that acts of love and the struggle for justice and progress always have a place in human hearts. They show us what God is like and encourage us to be like God. Putting this belief into action, Trocaire is Christ-like and makes the world a better place every single day. Most poor people in the world are also people of faith. They share a religious understanding of life with Trocaire. This means that poor people all over the world get Trocaire because, like them, Trocaire are people of God. The late Noreen Gumbo was the embodiment of Trocaire's virtues, and I dedicate this lecture to her memory. It was Noreen and Trocaire who first funded me to make my academic turn away from thinking about war to thinking about climate, nature, and the earth. Noreen made possible my recent book, Humanitarianism 2.0, just as she made possible so many other things for so many other people. As a Catholic leader for international justice and peace, Noreen remains an example to us all. In my lecture this evening, I want to think with you about a grave problem of political attention that we face in the world today. It is quite simply that when we should be all focused on one thing, we are instead focused on another. At a time when all political leaders and all the world's citizens should, above all else, be thinking and working on the survival of humanity, nature, and the earth in our long climate emergency, we are instead increasingly focused on defense and preparations for war. Two things can, of course, be equally important at the same time. The risk of war and the risk of climate change are both extremely important. But war has this terrible habit of stealing all the political oxygen and preoccupying politicians and citizens alike with a short-term view. This, I think, gives the church and all of us within the church a particular prophetic duty today. We must continue to speak and act to protect our climate and the natural world around us, and we must convince political leaders that war is not only a disaster in itself, but also a disastrous distraction from the much bigger all-earth threat of climate change. In Europe, this tragic diversion of political attention has been imposed on us by President Putin's wicked invasion of Ukraine and by President Trump's distrust of the EU and his government's demotion of Europe in US foreign policy from a firm ally to a civilizational risk. So we now live with the risk of a continental war between Europe and Russia. Putin's hybrid war of sabotage, drone infiltration, cyber attacks, and disinformation is already well underway across Europe to counter European support for Ukraine. And as a result, much of the talk in European capitals is of defense, not climate, nature, and development. And war is spread around the world, and not only in Europe. Trocaire is working in Ukraine, but much more so in the wars beyond Europe, which are devastating the lives and worlds of millions of people. And wherever there is war, it distracts political attention from the care for creation. And this week we have two new wars, one between Pakistan and the Taliban, and one now between the US and Israel against Iran. In Sudan, with support from Saudi, UAE, Russia, and Turkey, violent dictatorial men on both sides have robbed the Sudanese people of decades of progress and a peaceful transition to democracy, raping and murdering many thousands of people in the process and destroying their homes and their economy. The latest war between Hamas and Israel has seen political extremes in Palestinian and Israeli societies choose policies of massacre and mass destruction that have returned the people of Gaza to a tented life. The people of Eastern Congo are still enduring massacres and displacements as the legacy of the Rwandan genocide 30 years ago. Somalis remain locked in their long civil war. The people of South Sudan still live in the violent and negligent grip of their dictator. And the people of Myanmar are trapped in a nationwide war caused by their military dictatorship and people's deep desire for freedom. In all these wars, some people struggle to protect the natural world, but the biggest investments of money, time, and political attention go into fighting. Our geopolitical moment is one of dangerous flux, a geological flux in the earth itself and a political flux. The Greek prefix geo remembers the Greek word Gaia, the goddess of the earth. And this is such an important time for us to speak of geopolitics, because the earth as we know it and need it, as God made it for all life to flourish, is being dangerously changed. Every generation lives in a geopolitical moment, but ours is especially geocentric, because the whole Earth system is changing fast. It's systems of ice, water, oceans, air, land, and life. The Earth's human system of political order is also in flux. It too is melting down to take new shape by denorming, renorming, rearranging trade, switching alliances, and rearming. Our moment is therefore truly geocritical. It is an earth emergency in which the church is absolutely right to hear the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor simultaneously all around the world. When all our geopolitical attention should be focused on saving Mother Earth from a catastrophic change in the geological, ecological, and biological order, we are simultaneously faced with a disorienting change in the geopolitical order, which means we no longer have sufficient unanimity and political attention to work together. On the one hand, we face the rapid rearrangement of all life on Earth because of changing climate, weather patterns, biodiversity loss, and the transformation of natural landscapes. And on the other hand, we face the rapid rearrangement of political power across the Earth in a return to a world order of great powers, increasing conservative authoritarianism, the realignment of alliances, economic nationalism, and the uncoupling of the global economy. These are producing new geographies of conflict, power, and influence that are terrestrial and planetary, taking shape in outer space, in virtual space, and in the battle for geostrategic advantage in artificial intelligence. This coincidence, or not, of such deep rearrangements of ecological and political life on Earth presents two great challenges to our attention. An Earth emergency of climate and nature, in which the survival of humanity and creation is at stake, and the risk of war and the need for defense, in which our nations are at stake. And of course, these rearrangements overlap, as shown on a grand scale in the dispute over Greenland and the geostrategic dash for the melting high north, and locally in thousands of disputes over natural resources in communities around the world. The crisis of the earth and order place huge demands on our faith, our ethics, our imagination, and our politics. Both crises hinge upon our propensity to violence. Our violence towards one another in war, and our violence against nature and the earth. In other words, our intra-species violence and our inter-species violence. Following Christ through this geopolitical moment demands that we call all people of goodwill to a double love, the love of humanity and nature together. It demands that we recover political affection for our human neighbours and rediscover an emotional bond with nature as our neighbour too. Pope Francis led us beautifully towards an ecological conversion of the heart, which we must make to love nature as our neighbour and the earth as our common home. And Pope Leo is encouraging us to renew our commitment to peace with human neighbours. In Jesus, we know that God loves humanity and nature together, every human being and every lily of the field. The kingdom of God is to be enjoyed by all life on earth, not just human life, and our growth in godliness always follows the divine pattern of nature. A lost sheep is to be treasured. A mustard seed becomes a bush. A grain of wheat becomes a harvest. The Holy Spirit comes to us as living water, and a solid faith is built on rock. Our geopolitical mission today as Catholics is to call people to this double love, the simultaneous love of humanity and nature. We must refresh our relationships with our political and ecological neighbours. And this divinely given double love recognizes the mutualism between humanity and nature. It rejoices in human society as part of a much wider society of all created life, an earth community, as the great American eco-theologian Thomas Berry described it. This double love blossoms in Trocaire projects that combine a care for creation and a care for humanity. Human health and sustainable agriculture, education and climate action. Our challenge is to bring all nations back into one peaceful human community and to bring nature, its trees, mountains, oceans, animals, ice and insects, into the social and political life of the church and the world. Nature is an essential part of social justice because it too is our neighbour, made and loved by God. But what are we up against in proclaiming this double love and this new all-life kingdom of God? First, we are up against the cries of war, which have returned to our continent again and our world, and postponed earlier multilateral ambitions for development and peace. Secondly, we are faced with the challenge of giving the cry of the earth a voice at human tables, and a powerful way to speak with us as a neighbour. So let me look at these two things now. And first, the cries of war. Pope Leo has lamented the new zeal for war in the world today. This zeal is expressed in various war cries. The first is the renewed cry of political realism, which claims that liberal ideas of international idealism and multilateral cooperation are utopian and will not secure the national interest of states in our return to a world of great power, enmity, and competition. Instead, hard power and clear national self-interest must dictate the terms of national survival and create a geopolitical order based either in a balance of great powers or the planetary hegemony of a single power. President Putin's realism invaded Ukraine to achieve with blood and iron what he failed to achieve with poison and the manipulation of Ukrainian elections and the EU. Putin's war cry, like many others, was founded in a cry of grievance that the EU and NATO had aggressively expanded eastwards to control traditional Russian lands and Russian allies. Putin is wrong about this. Eastern European countries and Ukraine voluntarily moved towards the West, determined to be free from Moscow after decades of dictatorship, servitude, and relative isolation under the Soviet Empire. In truth, Russia's sense of humiliation and insecurity and its need for expansion is of its own making, because its European neighbors have rejected Putin's sinister political dictatorship. President Trump's second term, which came oven-ready with Project 2025, devised partly by conservative Catholics in America, also cried grievance and insecurity against friends and foes alike who have ripped off America for decades, commercially, developmentally, and in NATO. Russian aggression and US hostility have been rightly met with a reciprocal cry of war readiness in the EU and the UK. Significant military and economic support for Ukraine is combined with a massive expansion of the European defense industry and security budgets today. China and India are the least openly belligerent of today's great powers. China does not cry war as much as Russia, Europe, the US, UAE, and Saudi Arabia. Unique in its continuing international idealism, China's rhetoric holds true to the ideal of a shared future for humankind and harmony with nature, and wants to preserve the United Nations. But still, China has crushed Uyghur and Tibetan religious and cultural identity and very effectively imposed its party order on Hong Kong. China projects military power against Taiwan and across the South China Sea, and this in turn has created military resistance in the Indo-Pacific by India, Japan, Australia, and the US in the Quad Alliance, and the US, Australia, and the UK in the AUKUS Alliance. And the resistance of ASEAN states is constant in maritime scuffles and negotiations with China around the sea, the laws of the sea. And if these are some of the realist cries of war around the world today, they are, of course, accompanied by agonizing cries from war, from the millions of poor and suddenly impoverished people who suffer as civilians in Sudan, Congo, Gaza, Lebanon, Ukraine, Myanmar, and probably today in Iran as well. But ours is not simply an era of civilian suffering. Perhaps the loudest cries today may be the cries of pain and grief from military families and soldiers in Russia and Ukraine, whose bodies, minds, families, and opportunities will never be the same again. After 4 years of Russia's full invasion of Ukraine, there are perhaps 2 million soldiers killed, wounded, or missing, which dwarfs civilian deaths in most other wars today. Nature's cry from war must also be heard. Rightly given civilian status in the Geneva Conventions and the laws of war, nature should be protected from deliberate attack. Instead, it is often deliberately laid waste by burning, flooding, polluting, landmines, or simply occupied, harvested, and stolen by its owner's enemies. Environmental damage in war is often catastrophic for thousands of species, and this probably makes non-human life the single biggest casualty of war, as individual plant, animal, fish, and insect deaths far exceed human deaths. In response, legal scholars are now developing the crime of ecocide to complement the crime of genocide. And this must be right and deserves our support in the spirit of Laudate Si and our care for creation. Finally, on war, I want to stretch the meaning of war into a metaphor and argue that the Taliban's wicked doctrinal attack on the full humanity of women and girls must be seen as a war against the true nature and vocation of women in society. The Taliban's ungodly and disgraceful policies to limit women's education, freedom of movement and association, their right to work, deliberately destroys feminine flourishing in Afghan society and a sharing of the good life between women and men, boys and girls. And this persecution is a crime against female humanity and a permanent violation of the human rights of half the population of Afghanistan, some 25 million women and girls. In contrast, Trocare's success in supporting women-led organizations around the world is a joyful defiance of the wickedness of the Taliban dogma and any other misogyny. In every war, from soldier, civilian, and nature alike, we always hear cries of courage, resistance, resilience, innovation, and victory too. We hear people determined to survive, to care for others, and to win. We see nature bouncing back and re-entering human society in new pollination, new plantings, new growth, new song, new flowing water, and adaptation of all kinds. It is the mission of a church which knows Christ crucified and risen to respond to cries of distress and cries of hope. And as Catholics, we must console cries of pain and suffering, and we must encourage cries of resistance, resilience, and new life in humanity and nature. Annoyingly, my lecture this evening, I think, may itself have fallen victim to the very distortion of attention that I mentioned at the outset of this lecture. I've probably talked too long. Of war, maybe just too long for you guys, too long of war when our real challenge is the Earth emergency, which threatens the whole world. In today's geopolitics, one very important task for every parish and every diocese, and for Catholic diplomacy worldwide, is to bring the cry of the earth into political discussions so that the voices of nature are heard alongside human voices in an all-life politics that is louder than the cries of war. Innovative nature diplomacy is essential for success in the earth emergency. In our own parliaments, at the UN in Nairobi, Geneva, New York and Rome, we must find creative ways to bring nature to the table. Nature's needs must be imaginatively represented and understood and properly entangled with human needs in our political forums, just as they are in real life. There are parallels, I think, between the evolution of war diplomacy and the possible future of nature diplomacy. The war humanitarianism of the 19th and 20th centuries has given legal form and diplomatic voice to previously excluded experiences of human life, like wounded soldiers, refugees, children, and civilians. Before the modern surge in humanitarian diplomacy, none of these groups were envisaged as legitimate political subjects entitled to a diplomatic voice around the tables of state power. Today, they are. So it will be with nature, I hope. The ecological humanitarianism of the 21st century that sees humans and natures as neighbors must similarly evolve new forms of diplomatic representation of other life. We already have a long tradition of nature diplomacy. Much of it is carried in great organizations like World Wildlife Fund, International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and in our own Laudate Si movement. And this diplomatic effort received a huge surge from the Great Earth Summit in Rio in 1992, and the 3 Rio conventions that continue to live on in our great COP meetings on climate, biodiversity, and desertification. But in this diplomatic tradition, nature is still a subject of human discussion, rather than a political subject in its own right. Nature is talked about, but not talking. Diplomatic innovation which lets nature speak must now emerge in various ways. Members of parliaments for rivers, ocean embassies that represent the interests of the seas, or animal diplomats who act as go-betweens in our relationships with particular species. States could even recognize large parts of the earth, like Antarctica, as nature sovereigns, with seats of their own at the United Nations. Many of the world's indigenous peoples seamlessly recognize nature as a political neighbor, whose interests as different species must have a stake in the politics of the forest, the river, or the range. Wearing masks and totems, indigenous people deliberately bring nature into human politics. Recognizing the rights of nature is another political option. Nature's rights are affirmed in Ecuador's constitution and in national legislation in countries like Bolivia, Panama, Spain, Uganda, and New Zealand. At Blackfriars in Oxford, as part of our work on nature as neighbour, we have begun a project called Nature as Diplomat to explore how to represent nature more effectively in international diplomacy. I feel there must be ways that forests, rivers, animals, oceans can speak as themselves, but I don't know exactly how this will happen. In the Bible, Balaam's donkey eventually spoke up because he was receiving such an unreasonable beating. Perhaps this is what we are experiencing now in the storms, fires, droughts, and winds that break around us, and the martyrdom of so much other life directly at our hands or from a warming world. Enabling nature as a diplomat requires good communication of deep science, new efforts at interspecies empathy, and an element of shamanistic skill, because sadly, most of us are not like King Solomon or St. Francis of Assisi, who could talk with animals, or St. Anthony of Padua, whose sermons were supposedly greatly appreciated and understood by fish. The earth is full of sounds from animals, birds and insects, oceans, rivers and winds, from grasses, trees and plants. Individual creatures cry at each other and at us, all around us. And the interaction between wind and leaves, rain and soil, ocean and rock, make many sounds that we know well. Nature creates much of the soundscape around us, although much less than it once did. While we have our own understanding of what all this sound means to us, we do not really know what it means to the other life that makes it. The narrow limit of our hearing in our ears also means we cannot hear most of nature's voice at all, like the sounds which elephants hear through their feet from distant herds, and the mass of ultrasonic sound that fills the world around us that we cannot hear. Somehow, I think we must try harder to let nature talk in our parliaments and in our international conferences and listen to it better. Every ecologist, of course, will tell you that the great risk here is anthropomorphism and political ventriloquism, in which we sit nature on our knee like a dummy and talk through it and for it in our own interests. This is not political representation, of course, it's political manipulation. And we're alert to it already, because politicians do it all the time on our behalf in politics anyway. Interspecies empathy requires deep imagination of the experience of other life. And in Ireland, I think you have a story about the wisdom of a salmon and how one man migrated into a salmon and lived as a salmon for a while. And within the salmon and the river, he experienced the physical freedom of a salmon and its superior knowledge. As Baptiste Morisot, the French philosopher, suggests in his wonderful book, Wild Diplomacy, we need people like this to work as diplomats between species, to understand how other species live and how we can prosper with them as good neighbours, just as St. Francis did with the wolf. So I'm going to end by addressing you all as Catholic diplomats today. There are several kinds of Catholic diplomacy, of course, the formal, bilateral, and multilateral diplomacy of the Holy See, the particular diplomacy of religious orders like the Jesuits, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, who I live with, and the Order of Malta at the United Nations, and the humanitarian and development diplomacy of Trocaire, Caritas International, and SIDSE. But there is also the everyday diplomacy of each one of us as Catholics in our parishes, dioceses, schools, and colleges, as we work as citizens with our human and nature neighbours in social justice and ecumenical efforts. At every level, we must promote the Church's double love for humanity and nature. And as we do so, I think we will discover that our own society and international society is not as conflicted and divided as political and social media influencers would like us to believe. Although the US government has very foolishly withdrawn from international climate agreements and repealed so much of its own federal environmental protection laws, the great majority of the world disagrees with them and is still working together on climate and nature diplomacy. And many US states, businesses, and citizens also remain actively engaged. And the more people everywhere have damaging experience of floods, storms, heat waves, and nature loss, the more they will cooperate. Being diplomats for God's double love of humanity and nature must be our task in a warm embrace of our political and ecological neighbours. One of the biggest challenges for the world in the 21st century is to move beyond a 20th century idea of being an international community of states to become an earth community of all life. This is a new diplomacy, a new multilateralism, and a new geopolitics, but it has always been our faith. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, come up here.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Hugo. And if, like the rest of you, my head is full of thousands of questions and thoughts. So maybe what we are going to do is just open up for any questions, thoughts, or things that come to mind following Dr. Hugo's input to us tonight. So if you want to just raise your hands, we have a couple of roving mics, and we also have some questions I think that people can pose online if you're watching tonight, and we will take those questions as well. So I'll open up for questions if anyone would like to start. I actually have one question to start us already coming in online, and this is, Hugo, what concrete steps does Hugo suggest that the church, particularly the church hierarchy and organisations like Trocaire, should take to rebalance towards climate and nature?
Thank you very much. So I think practical steps. I think the Laudate Si movement is doing a great job. But I think, as I said, we all need to make it clear that this double love, this simultaneous care for creation and humans together, for nature and humans together, is really important. And we must not let the cries of war drown out this deeper concern. So I think as Catholics we have to stay identified with this great cause of the earth and represent it in our meetings, in all our individual encounters, and internationally in the great forums of the world. And I also think, interestingly, we can find extraordinary allies to do with this with. I work in China once a year for a month, and I also teach another time and work with the Chinese Red Cross there. And Chinese ideology, albeit in the communist tradition, is resolute in its determination to value nature and value harmony. So there are big civilizational alliances we can make, actually. And certainly in East Africa, where I was 2 weeks ago with the British government's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, helping them in their climate and nature diplomacy, everybody shares this common ground. Anyone who knows about life, and particularly rural life, and increasingly urban life, which is getting hotter and more difficult, knows that we must embrace nature as our neighbour in somehow and work with it. So I think it just has to become a core part of who we are as Catholics, and we need to build global alliances.
Thank you so much for the question online. Maybe a question here in the audience, if anybody would like to ask a question. Yes, please. You just see the mic here. So Kevin, thanks.
Two microphones. I'll never shut up now with two microphones. I think this is a kind of, I suppose, a mixture of stuff. I'm thinking in terms of frontiers. You know, when you're talking about war, one of the challenges obviously is the lack of respect for international boundaries. We've seen it obviously in Ukraine, Russia, and we've seen it now more recently in the Iran situation. And yet, when you look at nature, you realise that actually one of the interesting things is while mountains and rivers form natural boundaries, nature itself knows no boundaries. I think in the Pope John Paul was standing on the seashore in Gdansk shortly after, I think on his first visit back to Poland, where he said, look, you know, the sea out here is what divides us from our neighbours, but it is also what joins us with our neighbours. So I'm wondering if, and I don't have an answer to this obviously, so that's why I'm asking you, but if an overemphasis on frontiers and boundaries, which didn't exist, I think, you know, in previous centuries, has created more problems than it has solved.
Thank you, Bishop. It's a great question, and I think humans will always want boundaries. I think it's almost part of our species to want boundaries and borders. But then so do animals and other forms of nature. And I think one of the things, you know, we're going to do over the next 100 years is probably to recognize, if we're any good, and we do pull off this response to the Earth emergency, we're going to recognize overlapping nature sovereignties around us and say, no, we're not the only ones that mark out our territory. And on our territory, there are all sorts of overlapping other sovereignties of animals, of nature, of flowers, of pollination, etc. There's a wonderful map in Baptiste Morizot's book on wild diplomacy. And as an Englishman, I find it rather difficult to have a French hero at the moment. But I do have a French hero because he's great. And he shows different areas of wolf, because he works with wolves. Wolves' idea of sovereignty and territory and how it overlaps, and then how it maps onto what we think is a human territory. And I think if we can get to this recognition that we're not the only ones who have ideas of sovereignty and territory and space and meaning in that terms, we will be a much better steward of creation if we tolerate the sovereignty of other life as existing in parallel and simultaneously with ours. And I would love to think in 100 years' time, the United Nations will be an Earth community and it will recognize different sovereignties that we all overlap with. So I really agree with the sentiment of your question and hope we can agree somehow multiple sovereignties and territories. And I'm very encouraged. I heard from Jane today that the church itself here in Ireland has agreed to do sort of the 30-30 agreement of the Biodiversity Treaty, and that you've set aside 30% of your church lands for nature again. Well, that's a fabulous example of that in action, that actually you're recognizing you're not the only ones who sort of has rights to this territory, and nature should flourish in its own sovereign areas. I think that's lovely, and I don't know if we're doing it in Britain, probably not, but we should follow your example.
Thank you. We have 170 people currently watching online. Another question that's just come in. Dr. Hugo, how can faith communities keep climate action on the agenda at times of such conflict?
So it's a great question. First of all, I must say you're all very polite in Ireland. Everyone calls me Dr. Hugo. Nobody calls me that in England, you know. But I think we have to keep our voice up, and I think one of the ways to do it is to talk about how nature suffers in war and how disastrous that is. One of the, I've written a lot on war in my life, and I've been in libraries studying terrible human atrocities, and it's bizarrely hard being in a library studying war and human rights violations. It's really tough, and you get incredibly sad. But writing this book, the saddest thing I read was an all-life assessment of casualties, death, and displacement in the Australian bushfires of, I think it was 2017, 2019. And the ecologists all got together and said, right, we're going to really work out not just how humans suffered here, but how all nature suffered. And it was, I really, I don't often cry anymore these days when I'm reading terrible things because I've become immune and horrible, but I really started crying. It was just a devastating list of plants and animals, habitats destroyed, displaced animals, wounded animals, trees completely burnt and ruined. And it's devastating. And I think we can bring that to the table of war and make people realize that if they're crying for war and going into war, that there's going to be huge nature suffering and nature casualties. And I think we need to start, in my book, I argue that humanitarians and ecologists should work together, and not just looking at people in need, but looking at places in need, and take a landscape view of assessment and who's suffering, what creatures, what species, who's suffering in this war. And then I think that could make a difference if we start putting the numbers and facts to the damage of war.
Thank you. I'll open up to another question here in the room.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture, Dr. Slim. I'm going to follow up on the boundaries question from Bishop Doran. On a recent trip back to the United States, I noticed there are fewer Canadians there, but I noticed many Canadian geese still there, which I appreciated. But there's another boundary that has to do with the anthropocentrism, how we are to be one another's neighbors as humans, but also neighbors with nature. But there's a number of theologians that are even drilling down further on that. When I look at you, I see a human being, but there's many microbes and other organisms in you and on you. And Pope Francis noted that, the chemicals, everything, the cosmic dust, everything that runs through nature is, we are nature too. So that boundary between humankind and nature, it's a distinction, but it breaks down at some point right there. And I was wondering if you might say a little bit more about that. Like peace on earth, Pacem in Terris, really is also about peace with earth.
Yeah. I totally agree with that, Tobias, and it's lovely to see you here, and it's lovely to have an American in the audience as well. I'm, critical of American policy at the moment, but I love Americans, so it's great you're here. I think that's really true, and the biologists have a horrible word for this, the fact that they call it a holobiont, that we are a holistic biology. We're not just a single species. We're full of other species and covered in other species, as you're saying. So we recognize that. People live from us, and, for us, for various species, we are planet Earth. That's what they know. And I hope we will get to this consciousness of an all-life kingdom, as I've been saying. And I think science will help us, but I think Pope Francis's idea of a conversion of the heart will help us too, because if we do honestly turn and see, as he asks us to do in Laudate Si, that, if we were the Good Samaritan today, we wouldn't just reach out to a human suffering, we would look and turn aside to a river dried up, or a forest on fire, or animals dehydrated and suffering. And if we can reach this new consciousness, and of course, for us in the West, it's really a return to an original consciousness that many indigenous people in South America, Africa, and Asia have never lost, but because of our industrialization and our reification and bifurcation of humans and nature, we have to rediscover this. But I think it'll be a wonderful thing. I think it's very exciting. I'm usually an optimist, actually, and I think it's very exciting that we might reach this, or return to this consciousness that we see ourselves as part of nature, and we create an Earth community.
One more question here at the front first, Roisin, please. Yeah.
Hello. I'm looking behind you there, hold fast to love and justice. And I don't know what I'm doing here.
I think it's the two mic thing.
I was in Liberia during and after the conflict, and I'm thinking of, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm thinking of a woman I saw standing with probably all that she had left in a basin on her head, and I'm thinking, I can't be telling her what she should and shouldn't be doing about, looking after animals or nature. And there's a film, if you haven't seen it, I recommend looking at it, called Pray the Devil Back to Hell. And it was about ending the conflict in Liberia, and I can think of a few devils I'd like to pray back to hell. And I've been given hope in recent times by presidents of Botswana and other African countries speaking out and refusing to take money with terms attached. And I'm thinking about work that's being done and companies that go into Africa, which I know because I've been in many African countries, I don't know Asia at all, with terms attached. And one of the things in Liberia, I know a friend of mine worked in agriculture, and I think human level is where we need to focus on, and yes, then engage with looking after agriculture and the earth, but you've got to look after the human level first. And on the border thing, all the borders are in artificial places. They're all in the wrong place, put there by the British and the French, and whoever else put them there. They need to be all shifted to one side. That's just an aside. Thank you.
So I think that's a really interesting question. It's about, how do you prioritize? Should you prioritize humans first and or nature? And I really do believe they're sort of indissoluble. Because as a humanitarian, as I was saying with students this morning, whenever a humanitarian wants to save a human life, the first thing we do to save a human life is to plug that human life back into nature, back into water, back into food, back into clean air and shade and shelter. And so we know that we are nothing without nature around us. So I deeply believe we have to try and focus on them simultaneously and save them simultaneously. And recently talking to people working in Somalia, and actually Trocaire as well, when I was with the UN team and the British government team in Somalia, without me prompting anything, they said, I was saying, who's the best? Who's doing the best in Somalia? And they said, oh, Trocaire is always the best in Somalia. And it's amazing. And that environment tells you you're not going to help people at all unless you help the nature around them. And very often when if I speak to someone in that position and I ask them how they are, they will actually look away from themselves and turn and point to their environment and say, there is no water, there is no food, or we're being bitten by terrible mosquitoes, the enemy in nature, because there is an enemy in nature. And you solve people's problems by working with and on nature as well, always. So I do think they're sort of indissoluble.
Thank you. Question here, Rosie.
Thank you so much for a brilliant presentation. So I've been working with Trocaire in Somalia for the past 8 years, and the honour of my life, believe me. My question to you is about a new ecumenism that you beautifully articulated there. And I'm wondering, is it possible with the hierarchical systems that exist in humanity? Because the struggle oftentimes, and I'm talking as a humanitarian, and not speaking about the church, although we may learn something as a church from that as well, but within the humanitarian system, the top-down nature of dealing with malnutrition, hunger, development, all the issues, does not seem to have worked, has been an inordinate waste of money oftentimes, and just about got us out of jail in the most recent major crisis, nutrition crisis 2-3 years ago. And I'm wondering, have we something more to learn from nature about how systems work? I'm not sure that we're quite on the ball, that if we continue a top-down version, for example, the UN system, which has oftentimes failed brutally, for example, in the health system in Somalia, that we need to learn more about grounded up solutions. For example, the solutions that began in Latin America in the 1970s, the conversations that communities have, what Sussex University taught us in the 1980s and 1990s, what Trocaire is doing now in Somalia around community conversations about communities and nature articulating their own needs and moving from there rather than solutions being imposed from above. I wonder, have you thought about that and whether you think that should be part of the discussion? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a lovely, rich question. I think, yes, I think we should follow more ecological models of mind than we do. And when I was doing it in East Africa, I'm always ticking off the UN when they use architectural metaphors for how they're going to organize their projects. Because they always say, well, we'll have 4 pillars and a roof, and then we'll, And I'm saying, look, just get rid of all these human architectural models. Use ecological metaphors. Talk about streams and watersheds and ecosystems and how you could actually organically develop programming with other people around you in some way, in a much more symbiotic way than a architectural sort of human imposed way. So I agree with that, and I think there's a lot that would happen if, in the same that Tobias is saying, how can we change our whole consciousness? If we changed our metaphors, actually, that would lead us into a better place. And that's why I mentioned that most of Jesus' metaphors are nature-based, if you like. And I think we should stick to that, because then we'll be much more sensitive to the way things work. And I totally agree that if you take ecological framework, you could see that there were lots, and there always are, lots of smaller groups, and Trocaire is a smaller group in the way it works with community level, pushing up from the bottom. And then over the last 30 years, these big international beasts have sort of arrived in the ecosystem and had their way. Now, I actually think it's been amazing as well, because the big internationalization of humanitarian aid has saved a lot of lives in the wars of the 90s, 2000s, and early 2010s. But it's finished now. The survival ecosystem for those organizations is dwindling. Their life form is going to get smaller. And I think that gives you, like Trocaire and others, who are still alive and ready and feeding off a good, strong Irish base of support from people, you can work much more bottom up, and there are lots of you. And that will have much more critical mass now that the big beasts are smaller in a way. So I think it's a good time. But then the other thing I would say is that, you know, we are talking about an earth emergency and earth. We're not talking about heaven. And this is, you know, it's always going to be a struggle. There will never be a solution, I think, to the sort of human condition in this way. We're always going to have challenges and struggle. We know that. So it will go on being difficult to negotiate, you know, small grassroots aid with government aid, government policy. And we also know realistically very often that real change in human civilizations and societies is created simultaneously bottom up, middle out, and top down. You know, that yes, we can pretend that everything came from liberation theology or something, but actually there are other things going on as well. And I think we should realize that not one bit of the ecosystem will create perfection.
Here at the front, maybe it was.
Hello, thank you very much, Dr. Hugo, for your very thought-provoking speech. I'd like to ask a question which you didn't mention about the worldwide fossil fuel industry, because it's very obvious that the fossil fuel industry who are pulling the strings behind the political leaders whom you referred to in your talk, between Putin and his shadow fleet distributing his oil around the world, and obviously Trump was very much influenced by the fossil fuel industry and funded in his re-election by them, and they're all dancing to the tune of the fossil fuel industry. And I'm wondering what you can suggest, what the leadership and membership of the Catholic Church can do to stand up to the fuel industry and make the provision of renewables more commonly used throughout the world, and to help the people in this side of the world and the more developing areas to have more equitable fuel.
It's a great question, and I think the Catholic Church should stay resolute on demanding and hoping and praying for and working for a transition to renewable energy. And it should be front and center in everything that the Church does. At the same time, we have to recognize that there are transition challenges for poor people, for ordinary people, for whole societies to transition through fossil fuels into green energy. So we need to have tolerance for some transition arrangements where people don't come off oil and gas all the time, where we reduce it, where we work for net zero and things, and where we take care of people who are transitioning out of fossil fuel-based work and labor into new green economy jobs. So it's a complicated challenge, but there's no doubt in my mind that we should stay resolute arguing for a green energy future and exposing fossil fuel wars and interests and things like that. But I think we have to take account of just transitions as well and think about people's experience of actually coming off oil and gas into new technologies. I'm also hoping that our movement to end reliance on fossil fuels will have a nice strategic coincidence in Europe, at least, with the fact that we're now looking around saying, oh no, we've got another fossil fuel war all over West Asia and the Middle East now. This stuff is just too volatile, too unstable politically in terms of our own national security to actually really focus on. We have to, as Europe now, geostrategically say we're going to be renewable powers that we are in charge of much, much more. So I hope in Europe at least, geostrategic necessity will fall in line with Catholic hope.
Thank you very much. A question online. Dr. Hugo, are you hopeful And can you see seeds of hope and solidarity?
Yes, I am. I'm quite a hopeful person, actually, and I never believe this stuff that a lot of NGOs and people say, never before, the world is worse than ever. I don't believe that at all. I think, gosh, my poor grandparents living through 2 world wars, a recession, goodness knows what. What could be, this is a much better time than that. But we do have this critical challenge of the Earth emergency. But I am hopeful because I think humans are good in a crisis. And I think we will produce a lot of new ideas, new inventions, new adaptations. There will be terrible suffering. A lot of people will be left behind. Winners will come and go, and things will happen. But I do think we will get to the next place. But we can only do it by saving nature and humans and really living that double love so that we do that together. But I'm optimistic about businesses' incentives and ability to change and adapt and come up with new technologies. I'm optimistic by people's solidarity, working together in groups like yours and all over the world to say, no, we've had enough of these fuels. They're polluting, they're ghastly, they're blowing up the world. Let's find something new. And I'm also hopeful that we will, after this rumbustious moment, find really visionary and good politicians again who have time and space to set a better course. And I hope that will come too. So that is my hope.
Thank you very much, Hugo. Thank you. Thank you very much. I know there's a lot more questions out there. I could see a number of other hands, and we also had more questions come in online. So I presume we could be here for the next hour. But it is my job to draw the evening to a close, at least this part of it. But you will have a chance to meet with Hugo and also to engage with him afterwards. I just want to say a huge thank you to Hugo for being here in Maynooth. I think the thoughtfulness of your input tonight and also the depth of feeling and thought that you gave all of us, I think, exists way beyond the moments in which we heard you, but leaves with us a reflection to take away. So I just want to say a huge thank you, Hugo, for being here with us tonight.
Thank you.
Yeah. I want to thank St. Patrick's College Maynooth for providing their ongoing support for this lecture and for the collaboration with Trocaire. Thanks to Father Michael and thanks to all the staff of St. Patrick's College Maynooth. Also just want to thank Cries Communications who are providing the sound and the online facilitation for this evening. We had 170 people online tonight listening to the lecture, so it's fantastic to have such participation online added to those who are here in the room. Just to let you know that we have recorded the lecture. We'll share it on the Trocaire YouTube channel, and also everyone who registered will receive an email with a link to the lecture. So you can enjoy it again as well as being here tonight. I just want to thank also the Trocaire staff, Jane, and all of those volunteers who put effort into making tonight happen. Finally, starting off where Hugo started in his speech, want to thank the family of Noreen for being here with us tonight, especially to you, Madame Bay, because this lecture was in Noreen's memory, and Noreen is somebody that all of us remember with huge fondness for the work that she did and with huge appreciation for the lasting legacy that she left to all of us in Trocaire. So thank you for being here. And finally, we'd like to invite all of you here in the room to a little reception in Pugin Hall, and thanks St. Patrick's College Maynooth for putting it on. So everyone is welcome to have a cup of tea, and if you have questions that you weren't able to ask here in the room. You get a chance to talk to Dr. Hugo face to face and put whatever questions you want to him. Thank you all for participating this evening. Thank you for being here, and thank you for all of those online and for what made a really fantastic evening. Thank you very much.
We'll break it down for